I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to Leadovation. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. This podcast is dedicated to the art and science of innovative leadership. Through insightful interviews with industry experts, I bring you cutting-edge strategies and experiences of innovative leadership, helping you think differently, act strategically, and achieve remarkable results. Join me as I provide insights and tools that empower you to make smarter decisions, forge meaningful relationships. Welcome to Leadovation. So why do smart, capable people resist change, even when they know it's necessary? In this episode, I talked to Lisa Riegel, who brings neuroscience into the leadership and change perspective and in change management. She explains how our brains are wired for safety, why change feels threatening, and how past experiences quietly shape our reactions today. We also explore some very practical ways leaders can reduce fear, build trust, and help people move through change much more effectively. Lisa, it's nice to have you on the show. Thank you for your time. And I have been talking a lot with clients. For some reason, it's in the air about how difficult it is to change and our resistance to change. And there's so many different change management models out there. I'm sure, we could Google any one of them and find all sorts of great information. But you also have some background in neuroscience and you relay it to change. Teach us a little bit about what does the science say about why our little noggins have a hard time with change?
Yeah. So our brain, 80% of the traffic in our brain is below our nose. And so it's unconscious. So we do a tremendous amount of thinking that our conscious part of our brain is not, can't access, doesn't know what we're thinking. And so our brain is set up to keep us safe. And so things that are familiar, even when they're things that aren't really necessarily good for us, they're safe and they're comforting because we know what the outcome is. And so new things are scary. And when we go into a new setting, what our brain does is tries to say, this is like that, and make associations between what we are experiencing in the moment and what we've experienced in the past. So as we think about change, our brain is going to associate that with when I don't know, anxiety is the product of not knowing. So if I don't know for sure what this change looks like, or it's brand new, or it's this, it's going to associate anxiety and fear with that change. And for some people, it becomes debilitating. For some people, it energizes them. It gives them a little bit of juice of stress. And they're like, all right, let's change. Let's do this. And they're okay with it. But other folks, it can be very paralyzing. And then if they've had experiences with change in their past, maybe they got fired or they got replaced, or, sometimes I think leaders don't think about the fact that when we ask people to change, we're asking them to leave behind practices that they did well. And so there's an identity piece of like, I've been here for 10 years. I'm the informal leader on my team of this process or this whatever. And now all of a sudden that's going away. So where is my expertise? Who am I if I'm not that expert? I'm now equal with everybody else because we're all learning this together, and it can be kind of jarring. And so if you're a person who gets anxious about kind of being an overachiever or things like that, change can cause a lot of fear.
So it's a trigger.
It's a trigger. Yeah. And biologically, just a kind of a quick lesson in the neuroscience, I always tell people your brain's like a giant company. So just like, you're the leader up here, the prefrontal cortex is the conscious part of your brain. That's your CEO. And that's who you are. That's where your personality and your morals and your character lives. But the other part that's below your nose, you have a data department and you have a security department. I call the data department Harold. So Harold is my data manager. Okay. And Bob is my security monitor. So Harold's job is to talk to my vagus nerve, which is the largest nerve in my body. It runs down my neck, around my heart. It's my systems manager. And it's saying, is my stomach emptying? Is my heart pounding? And also, so that's interoception, but also proprioception, which is where's my body in space? Am I standing next to a cliff? I'm going to fall off. So that vagus nerve is always gathering information. fun fact, the way that we live our life today in a very sedentary way, we do not have good proprioception. We do not have good interoception. So our vagus nerve today will be agitated because we're not doing the things that we need to do in order to have good interoception and proprioception. So our
So
stress,
go.
yeah,
So the proprioception, that's interesting. So talk more about that. Again, just as the definition, it's where the body has awareness as to where it is in space relative to other bodies. It's why you don't roll off your bed at night, right, while you're sleeping.
right, right,
So
right.
what is it about our environment right now that is taxing or reducing that perception?
Well, part of it is that we're sitting still, right? So
Mm,
we're not moving our body through space. So our nerve doesn't need to practice keeping track of our body parts because they're always sitting still. And then
I
for
see.
younger students or for kids, like kids in elementary school and stuff, we develop that input by rolling down a hill, by hanging upside down, by doing the sit and spin or the merry-go-round. And that trains our body to pay attention that, even though I'm moving all over the place, I have to keep track of where these things are. And so the way we live our life and the way we play as kids, we're just not teaching our body how to do that. And so our vagus nerve is always like, well, you know what? I'm not really 100% sure where your feet are. So you could be standing next to a cliff. So I'm going to give a little bit of alert to Harold to say, hey, internally, you're doing great. Your heart's beating, your stomach's emptying, but like, I'm not real sure where your body parts are.
It's really interesting. So it's almost like a disconnect between the body and the mind, or
Yes.
a separation. I heard that if you play racket sports like pickleball, tennis, that eye-hand coordination, which again is that
Yep.
proprioception that you were describing,
Where your body
gets
is.
activated, right? And it's
Yep.
so how does all of that um, relate to longevity? I mean, I know that it does, but I don't quite have the connection.
Well, I think what the connection is that when the vagus nerve says you might be in danger, then Harold puts that in the report that goes to Bob, who's your security manager. And if Bob decides to be stressed, he's hitting that stress button. And the mechanism of stress in our body is inflammatory. So if you have chronic stress or if your body is always in a state of alarm and feeling danger, then you can end up like exacerbating arthritis. You can get autoimmune diseases. It's connected to rheumatoid arthritis, to lupus. It also
Hmm,
messes with people who have diabetes because when you have a stress reaction, sugar is released from your muscles. So they have a harder time managing
hmm,
their sugar because it's not operating correctly. A huge percentage of our population has sugar issues that can cause mental health symptoms. And it's actually not mental health, it's actually sugar problems. And so it becomes this whole mind body connection. And I think it's really interesting. If I always wonder, like, why do I have to buy dental insurance and eye insurance separately? They're literally part of my body. My eyes and teeth
good
are my
point.
body. Like, why
Right.
why is this separated? And we do the same thing with the mind and the body and the brain. If I have a brain problem, I go to a neurologist. If I have a mind problem, I go to a psychiatrist. If I have a body problem, I go to one of many different specialists. But the reality is they all interact with each other. And so it starts in that vagus nerve is an example of that because that's a nerve that is physical, right? That's your body. And it's your body telling your brain, hey, we're not so sure where things are. And then it's your brain saying to your amygdala, hey, mind, go get stressed.
Hmm.
So now I'm going to put body chemicals in you and I'm going
Yeah.
to have your CEO leave the building because we're in an emergency. And now we're going to run your brain. So it's all of these processes are interconnected, but we oftentimes don't think about that.
When you go into a work situation, when you introduce change and we're talking about something that's going to happen, you announce it. It's usually when we're sitting down
Mm-hmm.
and we absorb the information and we have whatever trigger we might have, if we do have one. I could see, based on what you just said, it just occurred to me like that's the time to stand up and walk around.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be the time. All right, team, I got to introduce the fact that we're going to do this new thing, but let's all
Yeah.
stand up and let's
Everybody
walk around the
stand up.
room. It may
Yes.
be a little ridiculous, but
Yeah.
there's something to be said for our ability to accept change while movement is happening versus being sedentary.
That would be a really interesting research project
We
to
should do
measure.
that. Lisa,
That
let's
would
write
be,
that one together.
yes, I think that would be a fascinating reason, because there is research on the what exercise does for your brain. And like, for if you have a job interview or you have something that's really like nerve-wracking, if you exercise about 30 minutes before, and it doesn't have to be like until you're like super sweaty, but like take a
Right,
brisk walk or things, the
right.
chemicals that your body releases actually sharpen your thinking and get you ready to perform. And so it would be interesting to think if it's the other way too, if it is a buffer that would help you prevent stress taking over. Because your body has 4 states of awake. So you can be calm, you can be alert, and alert is good stress. Alert's like before a pickleball match. You get a little
Hmm.
bit juiced up and you're focused and ready to go. Then you get into alarm, and that's when Bob, so Harold's written up this report. Vagus nerve gives him information. He also looks in the environment at the sensory information he gets. And Harold lives in the part of your brain that cannot tell time and cannot tell a story. So he's just looking at associations that you've made in your life, and they become kind of like filters. He writes up that report, and that report is based on how he pulls filters out of your sensory memories. And so,
Hmm.
for example, when I was a kid, my parents were divorced and my dad was always late. And so I spent a lot of time sitting on the front stoop waiting for him to pick me up. My little 8-year-old brain associated time with love or worth, right?
Hmm.
So through my 20s into my early 30s, if I was running late or if my husband was running late, like I would have anxiety, I'd get angry, and sometimes I'd have a hard time calming myself down to enjoy the beginning of my evening because my body would dysregulate. That association is faulty, right? Time doesn't equate with love. People are related for all kinds of reasons. Once I
Right.
understood that association, I was able to, as the CEO boss of my brain, I was able to say, Harold, don't make that association. It's
Hmm.
not accurate. So I don't want my body responding this way. So when we have self-awareness and we have self-regulating techniques, we actually have control. And so back to your thing about change, think about how many associations, not knowing or feeling inadequate or, those kinds of different underlying fears that people have in the moment, or fears that people have at work. It has nothing to do with what's happening right now. It has to do with their whole series of their history and how Harold is associating those past experiences with what's happening right now.
All right. So this is always the question that comes up when people talk about these triggers that you have already begun to introduce us to. You mentioned your 8-year-old brain.
Yep.
I was thinking about what my triggers are as a kid. Wasn't exactly the same, but it had to do with honesty and clarity and
Yep.
that sort of safety that creates or doesn't create if you don't have it. But my question is, if you have your prefrontal cortex, as you say, you're a CEO, and you go, hey, I guess what? I guess I'm being triggered because I am being reminded of something that is from many, many moons ago, childhood, for example. And I can tell my whatever, Bob or Harry,
Yeah.
hey, we don't need to have this interpretation.
Right.
The question is this. This is the one that keeps coming up. Is that enough? Can we just, by virtue of having the prefrontal cortex, rewrite the rules on the spot and then over a period of time create new neural pathways because we're no longer being a default to that old trigger, right? We start to
Right.
create a new pathway. Or do we need to, in some cases, get some therapy and talk about what happened when you were 8 and your father would be late to pick you up? Is that, how do we balance out those two approaches? Is both good? Are there some times that you need both? Is there sometimes that, you really don't need therapy? Just
Right.
tell your prefrontal cortex, get over it. Let's move on. What's your
Yeah.
sense about this approach?
I think it's and both. I mean, from a regulating stress in your body, because this part of your brain that's doing that function can't tell time and doesn't know a story, the therapy piece, as far as figuring out or forgiving people or things like that, that doesn't really have a big impact on the ability for you to, that neuroplasticity to train your brain to not have that association and to not let your body dysregulate. Like that's more mechanical. The therapy piece comes in where we need to rethink how we've been affected by it as a human, to retell the story, to look at different perspectives. So the therapy piece is about this part of our brain up top that can reason and tell a story and make sense of it. The brain training part is about the lower part of our brain. Now, sometimes in therapy, they will teach you how to regulate. They'll teach you how to
Sure.
calm your body down. So that's part of it. But when you think about talk therapy, trying to get at the root of the problem and understand how you feel about things, um, that's something that, just telling Harold to knock it off isn't going to do that.
Right, because it could be a pretty big trigger depending upon the circumstance.
Sure.
What, from a neurological perspective, is going on in the brain when we are having successful talk therapy?
Um, well, in the brain, so making a semantic memory, we think of our brain as having like a memory box, like a library, where we just go in and pull out a file and read it, and then we can examine it. But that's not how it actually works. All of our memories are fragmented into multiple parts of our brain. So, like our sensory memories are stored in the amygdala, which is in that limbic system. Can't tell time, doesn't know a story, just associations between these sensory data and how my body reacts, whether I'm in danger or not. Then we have episodic memories. So episodic memories tell a story. We have procedural memories. Those are different. They're stored in a different place. And then we have, if we want to make a semantic memory, then the CEO, so a semantic memory, meaning one we make meaning out of, which is what you would be doing in therapy, then that's when your prefrontal cortex has to call all these different departments and say, hey, send all the files up that you have on this particular topic. And then this part of our brain makes semantic meaning out of it. And that's where I think therapy can help, is because as those things are pulled up, the therapist can be, could two things be true at once? Could your perspective be different than someone else's perspective? Could you have viewed this situation differently? And that goes back to how Harold um, comes into play, because Harold takes in the information and then looks for those sensory associations, and those become almost like filters or screens. So if you think of reality like a banana, and then you have all these filters and screens that are based on how your brain has associated things from your past, how, what your confirmation biases are, all that.
Hmm.
It shoves that banana through those filters. And on the other side, it's still a banana, but it doesn't look like one. So I think, when you start to pull up the memories into your prefrontal cortex and you're in talk therapy and you're talking through, why did I make this association? What is going on here? And you're making more meaning out of it. That's something that Harold and Bob can't do.
So you mentioned that one of them, I'm losing track of which one's Bob and which one's Harold,
Yeah.
but nonetheless,
Harold's data, Bob is security. Bob's the one that
okay.
hits
So,
the like button.
which is the one that then doesn't have an association with time?
Neither of them. They're both
Neither of them.
located. They're both
Okay.
in your.
All
Yep.
right. God, neither of them.
I'm
All right.
blind.
So if this is sort of interesting to me, I don't know why, but I think by understanding this, it allows me and maybe people who are listening to this to find a system, a process, a method that can be useful for them when it comes to this topic around change. So if I have a memory, which is just a memory of something that took place maybe in real life, or maybe it was even an interpretation of something that took place in real life many, many moons ago. If I go through talk therapy, am I and I can say, I'm going to create a new interpretation of what happened when I was 5, right? Am I, in a sense, creating a new memory and replacing it with the old one? Am I almost like moving this deck chair off and this one on?
Yeah.
And I'm now going to orient myself to a chosen, made up, totally recognizable, I am doing this memory to remove what actually happened, or at least my interpretation of what happened. Is that what's going on here?
Can be. I mean, if you think about every time, like think about it in courts, like eyewitness accounts.
Yeah.
They oftentimes poke holes in those because every time we try to make a semantic meaning, a semantic memory, our brain has to call up all the files. Well, maybe your department the last time sent 4 files, and this time it sent 4 files and 2 more that weren't there before. So
Hmm.
every time we pull a memory up, our memory is slightly different. And then if you start to have that memory with talk, where you're starting to insert certain meaning into that memory, it starts to shift and shape how we look at those things. So, which is why sometimes you can have a traumatic event in your life, and in the moment, that traumatic event destroys you. Like, say, you know, for example, I was supposed to get married when I was 25. And then I realized I didn't want to get married to that guy. And at the moment, it was the worst thing that ever happened in my life. And it was, all the things that I think of. Well, now when I look back at that time, I see different things. I see warning
Hmm.
signs differently. I see strength in what I did instead of failure of not going through with something. I see, I positioned my emotional response differently to that. So memories are not as reliable as you think. They're constructed. There is no reality of a
Well,
memory.
there's we can really go down a rabbit hole on that one,
Yeah,
Lisa. Like
yeah.
what's real? What is
Right.
real?
Well, yeah, I
We're all
know.
making this is
Right.
matrix stuff now, right?
Yeah, it's true though, but
It truly
it's
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
you construct your own identity and you construct your own reality, and you have a lot of control over how you do that. You can tell your brain what you want it to see.
So I'm gonna just one more little sidebar in this thing around eye hand coordination or racket sports. It sounds like one of the reasons why people seem to be living longer with that kind of physical activity is not just because of the aerobic activity that's taking place, which is good. Or it's
Yep.
not just because maybe after a certain period of time, your average heart rate comes down. I had somebody on the podcast, hasn't gone live yet, but he said if you can lower your average heart rate down by 5 beats per minute on average over a period of time, you actually gain an extra year of life. It's like, oh, that's
Wow.
interesting. So,
Yeah.
so physical activity has some tremendous benefits, but I'm also sensing just how much, and I've never really got it so clearly than right now, is just why physical activity, especially eye hand coordination activities, is good for change management,
Yeah.
is good for releasing some of these old triggers that we're talking about, the 8-year-old who's waiting for dad or what have you,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that they go away, but you might have
Right.
more energy and you might be accessing more part of your brain, Bob and all the other ones in there,
Yeah.
versus just focusing on one.
Yeah. I think the key is if you have self-awareness, so you understand these triggers, you're aware of them, you're thinking about them, and if you have self-regulation, so you're doing some of the vagal nerve exercises, like one of the things I always recommend to people is to get this started because it takes repetition. It takes intention and repetition, right? So set an alarm on your phone for 30 minutes. When it goes off, just stand up, stretch your neck back and forth, roll your wrists, roll your ankles for a couple minutes, and then you put them down. And when you do that, you're telling your vagus nerve, here we are, we're good, here we are.
Hmm.
And then take a couple breaths and then go back to work. Takes you 30 seconds, 45 seconds. And then 30 minutes later, it goes off and you do it again. Well, what happens over time is your body doesn't need the alarm anymore. Your body starts to crave and do these exercises. It'll just like you'll find, like I do it and I'll find that like when I'm working on something every so often, I just like kind of, do this a little bit and stretch my neck and I don't have to think, oh, it's time to take a stress relief break. It's
Mm-hmm.
just becomes built into my body's rhythm and that can be really powerful because what you want to do is keep your body calm. And that helps your heart rate stay lower and everything else. And so that when stressors come at you, you're not already elevated into an alert phase because then it just takes a little bit to throw you over the edge.
Could you speak to, I'm changing the subject a little bit here, Lisa,
Sure.
about the role that, say, TikTok or other social media platforms that are immediate, fast acting kinds of blurbs of information that come at you. It's not the long, drawn out Hallmark movie. These are in short little blips of information, like flashes of light almost. How is that changing our brain and our addiction to these types of things? And relay it back to change as well, our change management.
Yeah. So, the all those systems are built on dopamine, and they come from gambling. They modeled them after
Mm.
slot machines. So it's about giving somebody just enough to get that little hit of dopamine. And by the way, AI is set up that way too. Like it's incentivized to keep you on, which is why if you ask it something, then it's always like, I can make a presentation for you, or I can do
Yeah,
this.
there's always something else. You're right.
Always something else. It tries to
I
keep you.
noticed that.
Yes. And so when we think about social media, the problem with social media is a couple things. First of all, it it creates a false sense of reality. Like I remember when I got on Facebook and
Hmm.
it was fun to troll your friends and see where everybody was from high school. And then after I was on it for a couple months, I just found that I was like mad because I was like, why is everybody else on vacation? I mean, what am I doing wrong? Everyone's at a beach.
Yeah, I
Everybody's
know.
kids are beautiful and clean. And my kids, I can't get them to clean anything. They can't even shower. It was this. And so we have this fake persona in
Yes.
our, right? But here's the other problem with social media is because it's all built on that dopamine and the quick hits is I can get for a very low risk, I can get a high reward. I can change my profile picture to a flag or a ribbon or some cause and I get 4,000 rewards. Boom, 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 all day long.
Mm.
When I'm in a business and I'm working with somebody and say somebody's being mean to you or there's a conflict and I step in to resolve the conflict, that is a high risk and I get
Mm.
one thank you, low reward. So what we start to see is altruistic behavior, helping behaviors in the workplace have gone down and social anxiety goes up because the risk is high, the reward is low. It's easy to be a poser and a virtue signaler on social media and get all those dopamine hits and not to be authentic. But then what happens is we're lonely. We're the most connected that we've ever been in human history. And the National Institute of Health came out and said we have a loneliness epidemic because we're not getting the oxytocin and the chemicals that you get when you're breathing the same air with somebody sharing an experience.
Hmm.
So so I think that, and I talk a lot about belonging. And so social scientists studied a sense of belonging. They call it collective identity. And so basically it grew out of the research on diversity. We started diversity movements many, many years ago. And they said we basically failed because if you go places, you don't see the stock photo. You don't see different people from very different backgrounds with strong ties. You see people hunker down with people that are like them. So
Hmm.
they said, why? Well, then they started saying, well, where are there places that that's not the case? So they looked at the military and they said, okay, the military, soldiers form strong ties that last a lifetime, and they're wildly different from different demographics, socioeconomic levels, everything. So they talked about this collective identity, which is the idea that we have all these different pieces that make us who we are. I'm a mom, I'm a golf player, I'm a, speaker, an author, whatever. But if you and I are in the army together, before we're any of those things, we're a soldier. That's the collective identity. So
Hmm.
in a company, when you think about building a culture, are you building a collective identity in your staff where when we walk in, you and I are working maybe from different departments or you and I are very different people, but when we're here, we belong. And that belonging, that sense of belonging reduces our stress. It's kind of like if you ever walk in a meeting and you're like, oh God, these are not my people. You kind of
Hmm.
shut down, sit in the back and wait to leave. Where if you walk in and you're like, oh, these are my people, you get super excited to be there.
Yeah.
So, one of the things when you think about change management for leaders, like the foundation of change management is do you have a culture of trust and belonging where people feel psychologically safe in work? Because if not, change is even more scary because now I don't feel safe and now I have a risk. And that risk is terrifying.
It's interesting you say that because in companies, we have some energy and effort to create that collective belonging. We've got name of the company, we've got maybe our values, our strategies, but we often day in and day out work in silos or even work individually. We don't have that collective identity that you just mentioned. I heard something that we've done a few times, like we have a breakout group. I would do a lot of facilitation of teams and organizations, and I'll say, okay, you guys are going to tackle this question. You're going to tackle this question. But before you do, you got to name your team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Basically, you got to create a collective belonging. And once they come up with their ridiculous name, they're part of that tribe, so to speak, right?
Right.
And now when they talk to each other next, they almost like, oh, yeah, you're a part of my team. We are now a collective belonging. And it
Right.
seems to have created a bond that before wasn't there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and you think about from evolutionary psychology, I mean, having a sense of belonging, being part of a tribe was about staying alive. And so
Right.
our brain craves that sense of belonging because that's a safety mechanism for us. And so when you think about, being in a company where you don't feel like you belong, then you're always on a little bit of edge. And when I work with leaders on developing culture, I think that there's two things. One is that people spend thousands of dollars on posters and bracelets and t-shirts. Words are not a culture.
Mm-mm.
Culture is action. And so what does it look like? What does it sound like if you're living your corporate values? And there was some research that I quote in my book that the number of people who don't even know their company's strategic plan or mission or values, so the C-suite spent a lot of money and time creating them, but it's not being lived in the everyday culture.
Right.
Um,
Right.
the second thing is that, throwing a lunch for the employees every once in a while doesn't build a sense of belonging. It just fills
Right.
their stomach and they appreciate it. But,
Exactly.
I have a program that I do with leaders. It's called Punch It Up, and you have like options. So you could join a healthy lunch club. So say there's 10 of us that are part of the healthy lunch club. Then I only have to bring lunch once every 10 days, and I bring it for everybody and I give them my recipe.
Hmm.
And if
Hmm.
I participate in that, I get a punch. And I have to bring the recipe. So like if you see me, you could be like, "Oh, Lisa, that soup was amazing." And I'll be like, "Oh, that was my grandma's recipe." We just made a human to human connection.
Hmm.
The other thing is having like a morning happy hour. And that happy hour is like coffee and donuts. But the rule is that you can't talk about work. So
Hmm.
maybe the morning happy hour is like, okay, the theme for today is pets. Talk about your dog. Talk about your cat. What's the best pet you ever had? And
Hmm.
people start to make connections human to human. So later on, I'm like, oh, Dean's the guy who also really likes the dogs with the smashed in faces like I do. Right. Like, now we have something that ties us together that brings us a sense of togetherness versus just that's the guy from accounting. And so
It's
this
so
punch,
fascinating that we
yeah,
need to do
you get
this now.
right.
Whereas, 100 years ago, there was never a question about belonging. You were part of this family. You were part of this
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
I had spent 1 or 2 summers in Vermont, and I grew up in Minneapolis. And I don't even know if I knew my neighbors that well, kind of, like, hey, how are you doing as you pick up
Yeah.
the mail, whatever. But I remember I was out there in Vermont and somebody's barn was burning and everybody just stopped what they were doing in the
Yeah.
middle of whatever and all went to that one farm to help them put out the fire. And of course, then it turned into dinner. It just, that
It was
was
different.
so foreign and attractive that
Yeah.
we just don't see that as much. And now that we have the internet, now that we've got Zoom meetings and so forth, we have to really put an effort into creating those connections, whereas before they were just ubiquitous to our experience.
Well, the other thing too to consider, you mentioned social media before, but media in general, when I grew up, I watched Little House on the Prairie and Happy Days and Saved by the Bell and
Yeah.
shows that were about like family and, community, and you make a mistake and people forgive you and it's okay.
Mm,
We are now immersed in media that's like, hey, you and I are going to manipulate her and vote her off the island. It's about
right.
power and manipulation and
Right.
backstabbing. And so that sense of community that was a kind of baseline for us, so we didn't have to think about belonging because we already assumed belonging, is no longer there. So we
That's a
have
good
to
point.
we have to manufacture it.
And it seems like our heroes these days are people who just speak their mind, and even if it's inappropriate, almost
Yeah.
like speak to power, and they're rude often when they
Insult
do it. But we
people,
sort of
other
admire them for to do the things that we're too afraid to do.
yeah,
But it's kind of disruptive at the same time.
right. Well, and think
Doesn't
about
build
too
anything.
that risk reward again. Like it's like, man, if everywhere I look, I see people who used to work together and now they're tearing each other apart, and they're in fights on the internet, and they're, somebody says a comment. I mean, my gosh, go to Twitter and or any social media and look up a story about somebody who's excited about the puppy they just adopted. By 5 comments down, they're Satan. They're the devil. They adopted the wrong dog. They did the wrong, it's there's a lot of
Yeah.
fear to even open yourself up to anything. And then when you see your heroes modeling
Right.
othering and that it it's fearful, and it
It wasn't
erodes a
it.
sense of belonging as an American. Like, what does that mean anymore to
Right.
be an American and feel that sense of I'm part of something bigger than myself?
Totally, and kids are susceptible to this probably more than anybody. I just saw this is what at March 31st of 26, and there was just a big lawsuit that Meta lost because
Yep.
of the fact that they were being charged with creating an environment that was not safe for kids. And of course, they're creating an environment to create an addictive
Right.
interaction with these kids to kids. It's just
Yeah.
it's a tough time, for sure. There was
It
something
is.
else you mentioned about the technology piece around cell phones. I read something, I think it was Fast Company a few years ago that did a study that said that you got two groups of students, that doesn't have to be kids, that are equally aware and proficient in a topic. And one group of students can see their turned off cell
Yes.
phones. You know what I'm
I
talking about. It's
yes, I
like
do. It's
somewhere in the
immediate.
periphery of their minds. They can't,
Yeah.
it's over there on that desk. And then
Yep.
the other group of students can't see any technology at all. No cell phones, no computers, nothing. And they both take the tests, and it came out very clear that those who could not see their cell phones got a
Did better.
full letter grade higher than those that did not.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing for social emotional intelligence as well. That we're dumber
Yep.
and we're more less aware of ourselves and other people when these little devices
Yep.
are within an earshot.
Yep. Well, and now that AI is really changing things, research is calling it cognitive offloading. And
Mm,
so you think about like the CEO of your brain, and what is the job of your CEO? It's problem solving, reasoning, emotional regulation, impulse control, all of those things. Well, we keep offloading it and giving it, just like we don't memorize phone numbers anymore because our phone
right,
does it for us, right? Which is
right,
great. But the problem is what we're seeing in kids now is lower working memory, and working memory is needed for math, and our math scores are terrible. So
right.
as we start to adopt more technology and we offload all of that cognitive responsibility, what happens is that the CEO of our brain doesn't get good at his job. And so we do get dumber. And
So
that what scares me too is that this is what makes us humans. The rest of our brain is just an animal brain. So if we start to
you
cognitively
so for those who are only hearing our conversation, again, tell us where you're pointing on your
Yeah,
head.
pointing to the prefrontal cortex. If the
Yeah.
front if that's the part of our brain that makes us human, and the rest of our brain is just an animal brain, and if we are taking the thinking part of our brain and and then basically outsourcing to, an independent contractor of AI, what happens to humanity?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really
Totally.
and that's
It
something
is.
that I think leaders are gonna see in companies is a reduced cognitive ability of their staff to manage emotion, change, impulse.
Well, at least I think you are already seeing that. I know I'm already seeing it. I'm seeing that, crucial conversations, it's been around for a long time. People are having a much harder time with it. Social interaction, being able to just have normal chats and conversations. We are flabby and we are um, not trained in the art of human connection. We're getting worse and worse at it.
Yes,
But I do think, however, I want to leave on a positive note that you've created some really good ideas around how we can create those connections and how we can be able to sort of bypass some of the old stuff that's holding us back from a change management perspective. So I really
yep,
appreciate that.
yeah,
So tell us about how people can follow what you're about, your work. If somebody's listening, goes, I got to get a hold of Lisa. I want to know more about her.
yeah.
How do they do that?
Well, they can learn more about me at lisariegel.com or connect with me on LinkedIn and message me, and we can hop on a call. The other thing is I have a book called Aspirations to Operations that is for leaders and change management, thinking, how do I get
Hmm.
transformative change to stick? And it's all based in a foundation of neuroscience. It provides suggestions for building culture. So it's an 8C framework. The first C is culture. Then there's 3 C's that are about planning for change. And so there's clarity, there's cadence, and there's coherence. And so there's activities and things to think
Hmm.
about. Again, how do you reduce the stress? How do you communicate clearly what you want? How do you help? It goes back into how the brain responds when we feel a sense of efficacy versus dread. Then there's 2 C's that are about uh, engaging people. So the one is collaboration. How do you run meetings? How do you set up teams? The other is coaching. How do you use the brain science to help you understand that underlying fear that's holding people back? How do you sort your staff? We do an aptitude attitude matrix, and it's how do I coach them differently depending on which quadrant they're in? And then there's 2 C's around sustainability, and that's celebration and communication. And that's something else that I see a lot in leadership is that we really don't do a good job celebrating.
Mm-mm.
And we can use celebration to build collective efficacy. But throughout the whole book, it's designed to help leaders understand themselves better, gain that self-awareness, self-regulation, self-control. And it's to help them create a context that will build those skills that you and I are talking about that people are losing. How do we structure the context in a way that promotes humanity, promotes connection, promotes safety and belonging, and promotes thinking?
Well, I'll leave you with this one other thought that I remember reading just recently. There's a model, you know of it, I'm sure, called SCARF. And it's basically by a guy named David Rock, I think it is. He's a neuroscientist and a great person to read up on. But he said basically this non-prefrontal cortex part of our brain essentially sees a situation as a threat 5 times more than it's something to be seen as something positive. So we're kind of like already pre-wired to
Yeah.
be freaked out. But I
Yeah.
think your suggestions that you've given us today has been really helpful to move the pendulum more towards, no, this is something we can take action on. We're empowered. We can have agency over our
Yeah.
own lives and over our own brains because of some of the things you talked about. So thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's what I always, real change starts in the brain. And we
Yeah,
have a lot of power to shape the way that we want our brain to work and to lead it into happiness and fulfillment.
great. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you found value in today's conversation, please take a moment to rate and review our show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps more people discover Leadervation and this kind of conversation. And if you're looking to strengthen leadership, culture, or team performance in your organization, you can learn more about working with me and Mission Facilitators International at mfileadership.com.